In the last little while, if you've been following the TCG scene, you know that the Magic Pro Tour happened and that it got weird. Essentially, currently, the Magic's standard format is dominated by cards like Badger Mole Cub, and this has created a environment where the best decks basically require you to do a bunch of math to be able to play them at all, to be able to engage with gameplay, simply because there's a lot of like +1/+1 counters to matter, a lot of things that double power or add counters across the board. And it creates these situations which are pretty silly. And it's got a lot of people talking about complexity and depth. And for me, my favorite video on the subject that I've seen is from Distraction Makers. I think Gavin summed it up really succinctly and interestingly, and he was basically asking the question about whether current Magic is too complicated and whether the complexity that has been added in subsequent years is bad complexity. And I do think that there's a lot to unpack with that statement about, what is bad complexity, but ultimately, his conclusion from that video, and I think it was a reasonable one, is that a lot of the stuff that's going on in Standard right now and in Magic Design currently is leading to negative complexity for competitive players. Essentially, playing Magic at a optimal level is getting to the point where it involves such complex to manage board states that it becomes increasingly difficult to feel like you are making the correct, meaningful choice, even though that correct, meaningful choice exists, which I think is pretty frustrating. And I liked this video a lot, and all the things he was talking about really got me thinking about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it's interesting. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has this reputation in the trading card scene of being the complex game, the game that is too complex. And I think there's a lot to unpack with that notion. I think if you're talking about learning complexity, then Yu-Gi-Oh! Rightfully has that title of being probably the most complex game to get to the point where you're making meaningful choices. If you haven't seen it, I think it's unlikely if you're watching this video and you haven't seen this, but if you haven't seen my video about my first kind of 100 hours learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! I talk about this a lot. I talk about getting from absolute beginner who only understands how the moving pieces of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game works to going to making meaningful choices about where to use your cards. That time gap in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is longer than it is in any other game. You can, I think, pretty comfortably say that. But that's not really what this discussion about complexity is about. Because, yes, the game is complex to learn and complex to get to the point of making meaningful choices. But what about that next gap of going from making meaningful choices to being able to make the best meaningful choices in a spot, in a competitive setting? Is modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Too complex in this regard? And I wanted to use the same framework that Gavin used in his video to talk about complexity, to talk about card design, and really examine whether or not modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten to this point of being too complex from a competitive standpoint, or whether or not it's actually very reasonable. And just to kind of give you a bit of a spoiler ahead of time, I actually think that there's a reasonably compelling argument that modern Yu-Gi-Oh's complexity for competitive sake is actually better in a lot of cases than some other games, and in particular the current Magic Standard environment. And I'll kind of elaborate here in a bit about exactly why I think that is. So let's talk about the framework that Gavin used. He basically talked about two separate things, and I will go through them one at a time. So the first one that he talked about is this idea of evocative versus lenticular design. This is something that is coming from Mark Rosewater, Magic's main designer. And the idea is that lenticular design is this notion where we try to keep designs more simple to understand with hidden complexity for players who are able to engage with them in a really kind of like intense way. And I think a good example of cards that are like well designed from a lenticular standpoint are cards like Consider or like Serum Visions, Ponder, Preordain, these cantrip cards, where you look at a couple of cards, you put something, you either leave cards on top or you put them on the bottom and then you draw a card. From a very like simple, how does this card work standpoint, these cards are super easy to resolve. You pay your 1 blue mana or what have you, and you draw a card. Maybe you do some selecting based on what's on top, but even if you're like an absolute beginner, that card is very simple to understand. It's not very complicated. But obviously, if you've played a lot of Magic, and especially if you've played a lot of Magic in more Eternal formats where there are more of these card selection cards, you know that like resolving a brainstorm is among the more complicated things to do in Magic. And that's a really good example of, I think, of lenticular design, where the card is simple, but there are lots of complicated, nuanced experiences that can be generated from it. So this is the design that Magic worked under the, like, tried to basically achieve most of the time for the first 20-ish years of its existence. And I think they weren't doing it intentionally at first, so maybe you could narrow that to a shorter time frame. But this was the conscious choice they were making for a while, was to try and design cards that were lenticular, that had simple understanding from a like basic standpoint, but more complicated applications for competitive players. And in recent years, they've moved towards evocative design, which is this idea of we're willing to put the complexity up front. And it's obvious that this card is complex. There are lots of moving parts on the card, but you wrap it in a flavor that makes it exciting so that players are still willing to engage with that card and they still want to figure out how best to use it because it is really cool. And you can look to the fact that every Magic card these days has some kind of additional text on it. They don't print cards that have just a keyword or something like that on them these days. Everything has some other moving part to it, and typically as you move up the rarity scale, you end up with cards with more and more effects. So when we're talking about this framework, I think very clearly Yu-Gi-Oh! Has basically always, I think, leaned more towards the evocative design side of the coin. I think that if you look at, the average Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, you are accepting that there is inherent complexity behind the card. A lot of cards have 2, 3, sometimes even 4 effects on them, but, they are exciting. They're interesting. And especially too, like the theming of these cards is usually enough to get people excited about what's going on. I think of cards like say Mathmech Circular or something, right? Which is like a card that has a ton, like a wall of text on it. It does a bunch of things, and figuring out exactly how to best leverage all of those things in concert is in and of itself a puzzle. So it's not very lenticularly designed. I went back and I looked at kind of some of the of the older formats that people play to try to evaluate whether those formats have more lenticular design approaches, or whether they're also kind of leaning into evocative design. And I think that you could argue certainly that there is less complexity in these older cards for sure. But as it compares to Magic, I do still think that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always kind of embraced complexity, or more or less always kind of embraced complexity more than any other game. And so I think that a lot of the time, the design has skewed in the evocative direction. And I think there's a good reason for this that is unrelated to the card game almost, which is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of indelibly tied or is tied forever to fiction. It's tied to, a manga, it's tied to anime. And so as a result, like, because you have these fictional tie-ins that are creating these really like big flashy experiences, and that is the thing that you're using to try to attract players, you almost have this requirement to make it so that the cards that you are printing can evoke those same kind of feelings that people are getting from when they watch the TV show. So I think that in part explains the skew towards evocative design. And then the other thing that's a bit weird is, and Gavin didn't really talk about this, but I think that this is true, once you kind of open the evocative design Pandora's box, it's pretty challenging to shut it again. Because what are you going to do? Once you've started making these complicated, exciting cards, they are going to overshadow simple lenticular cards for most players. And at least in the Magic context too, because the player base has shifted to be one that plays Commander, one that plays these kind of bigger, flashier formats where you need your cards to be big and flashy, and ideally you might want them to be complicated so that you can like have this deck building feel good when you figure out how to put it all together. I think that it's very challenging for Magic to walk it back and say, let's try to design some of these more lenticular cards. I don't think that those cards are necessarily going to be as well received. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, I think that's the case as well, right? Like Yu-Gi-Oh can't just all of a sudden decide that it's going to start printing much simpler cards just for the sake of understandability. You've got to keep some level of this evocative design, of this kind of implied complexity. But I will say, in the Yu-Gi-Oh context at least, the evocative design is self-contained by archetypes in a way that I think overall reduces general complexity to the game, because not every card that's ever printed ties in with everything else. You do sort of have these guardrails that exist to reduce the level of complexity that's even possible for cards that are designed, especially in Engine. And I do think that that helps keep the competitive complexity lower. Certainly if you're a brand new player and you are trying to learn a bunch of engines all at the same time while you're playing games, yeah, that's going to be challenging because you're going to play against a different engine basically every round, and that's going to be difficult to engage with. But when you're talking about players who are competitive players who understand, 10, 15, 20 engines to a reasonable level at least, then you're going to all of a sudden, I think, have a much easier time engaging with this type of design. So the next framework that he talks about, and this is the one that we're really going to spend the most time, I think, discussing here today, are the 3 types of complexity. And he went through kind of like how these are all interplaying in Standard now to create what is arguably too complex of game states. So the first one is comprehension complexity. This is the idea of how hard is it to read a card and understand what it does. Are there a bunch of things on it that are not obvious, basically, or does the card just make sense just by reading it? And I think Yu-Gi-Oh in general is pretty well templated these days. I have gone back and looked at some of the old templating for Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and obviously that used to not be the case, but clearly Konami has identified that their initial passes on some of these rules texts were bad, and they've cleaned up a bunch of them. Someone sent me like the old DD Crow the old DD Crow text where it's like, by discarding this card, you may banish 1 card from your opponent's graveyard or something like that. And yeah, the passive voice was definitely something else. But obviously that's not how the card is templated in the modern day. And there are modern printings which have semicolons and colons and make life a lot easier to understand. And yeah, so consequently, the comprehension complexity on just reading Yu-Gi-Oh cards these days, I think, is fine. I will say there is additional comprehension complexity to Yu-Gi-Oh cards in that a lot of them are searchers or do things like put a thing in your graveyard or things of that ilk. And I think you could argue that that is both a strategic complexity issue and a comprehension complexity issue. Spoiler alert, strategic complexity is another one we're going to talk about. But it is true that, generally speaking, in order to understand how certain cards work, you do need to actually understand what your tutor options are, whether that's a strategic choice or whether that's just the basic comprehension of the card. I think varies deck to deck, in certain archetypes where there are very clear loops you have to go through of tutor, 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 tutor. and you search 5 times in a row, and the things that you search for are really important, that's probably more on the strategic end. But when it's just like, well, you just need to understand that this gets to search and you are going to choose different things a lot of the time, that I think starts to get into the realm of just being a comprehension complexity issue. You have to understand like what the options for this card are, and that's not necessarily strategic. That's just like if you were evaluating this card, part of the evaluation process would be what what does it do? what does this even find, right? I think of something like, say, like Mitsurugi Ritual. It's like, okay, you can ritual summon something, but what do you actually ritual summon? Like, in order to comprehend how that card works, you do kind of need to know about the other Mitsurugi ritual monsters to be able to evaluate whether or not the card is usable. So let's talk about the next one, which is this idea of strategic complexity. I already kind of alluded to it, but this is the idea of like, how hard is it to iterate through lines of play? So if you're taking your turn and you are trying to figure out what your turn is going to look like, what might happen after you take a particular game action, you have to iterate, right? And in Yu-Gi-Oh, when you're going first, this largely looks like mapping out your lines and then potentially trying to evaluate how your line changes based on the hand traps your opponent might have access to. So, you know, you might be mapping out a turn, and you have to sequence, you have to work out in your head where the ash choke points are. You have to work out when a search happens that might expose you to Droll and Lockbird. You know, have to work out if you want to play into infinite impermanence, or if you can find a way to play around the infinite impermanence. Those are the kinds of like strategic complexities that the going first player typically experiences. It's kind of mapping out this broad web of iterations and end boards that you can get to based on what interaction you think your opponent has. And then going second, I think generally we think of this as trying to break your opponent's board. You look at what your opponent has set up in terms of their disruptions, and you are trying to work out how you can sequence it in a way to get through these disruptions. And much like when you're going first, you're kind of trying to figure out where the lines are to get through hand traps. And in the going second example, you're typically mostly trying to figure out how you can break the board that your opponent has set up. I will add here, and I've mentioned this before, I think that this dynamic of going first, the strategic complexity is related to hand traps, and going second, ideally, the strategic complexity is related to what your opponent's board looks like, is where a lot of the feel bads around going second hand traps or going first hand traps come from, because it almost feels like it breaks the rules of what the game, quote unquote, is supposed to be about. If you're going first and you only have to think about the things that could be coming out of your opponent's hand, that's fine. If you're the going second player, you only had to think about what your opponent managed to put on the board. But obviously we know that's not the case. You also have to worry about, you know, do they have an ash to follow this up? Do they have other hand traps that they're going to have access to? And that, I think, creates a decent amount of frustration. I think that even if those were somehow represented in a way where you knew they existed, it would feel better. But because going second, you oftentimes have this experience of like, well, I have to break the board plus whatever they might have left in hand. That certainly generates some awkward feelings. And decks that are able to build boards while also potentially retaining a bunch of hand traps, I think, have created particular levels of frustration. I'm thinking things like, say, like Malice, for example. Like, a big complaint about that deck that I heard was that you just get hand trapped to death. Like, that it just draws a bunch of cards, and then it is able to both build its resilient layered end board and also have access to a bunch of hand traps in the follow-up. And, you know, playing through both of those things was exceptionally frustrating. So in terms of strategic complexity, I think that what you actually see in the Yu-Gi-Oh context is pretty good, like meaningful complexity, because all of the choices that you're making actually operate around like pretty simple interactions. So it's not as though you're dealing with a bunch of cascading effects generally. What has happened in Magic over the years is that as more and more cards have become more complicated, they have more text on them. When you do something, it can kind of set off this cascade of things that happen on the board where you end up with a stack of like 3 or 4 triggers happening, sometimes for both players. And as a result, those can get exceptionally difficult to decipher and to iterate through. Similarly, the existence of the stack also, I think, increases strategic complexity in a way that is interesting, but as cards get more complex, potentially becomes too much. So basically, like, because anytime there is a stack, you can add things to it at any time in the stack. It all of a sudden puts this pressure on. You have to iterate through, okay, if I put these 3 triggers on the stack and they respond after the first one, what happens? If they respond after the second one, what happens? If they respond after the third one, what happens? There's a lot of decision-making points, and that's not always, I think, necessarily a good thing. And obviously in Yu-Gi-Oh!, because of the way that chains work, it's easier to resolve. And also because there don't tend to be that many kind of like chain reaction effects that happen, I think it can be a little bit easier to resolve as well. So yeah, from that standpoint, I think it's also pretty reasonable. And when you're looking at resolving your turn in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game at a competitive level, when you are iterating through the possible options on your turn, typically the types of interactions that you're envisioning happening happen on more of like a 1-for-1 basis, as opposed to impacting a bunch of the stuff in your hand or on the board at the same time. So for example, like if I, normal summon a monster with an effect, more or less, the question is my opponent going to like negate or destroy that monster? And outside of those two things, it's not as though there's going to be that much going on where my opponent like negates my monster and then also does something else to something else on my board. Like, yes, that can happen if I have more stuff going on. You can end up in situations where your opponent like triggers multiple effects at once. Like, it's not impossible, but a lot of the time it's like, I play this, either they ash it or they don't. And so as a result, it makes resolving that web of iterations easier than I think you can sometimes see, especially in modern Magic. And then going second in the same way, I think that there's probably higher competitive complexity when you're going second, because your opponent can often have so many disruptions in such a layered end board. But at the same time, because it's mostly face-up information that both players have access, or that one player has access to, it makes iterating through the possibilities faster because there's less to play around in terms of the uncertainties. Again, with the exception of, some of these hand traps that you have going first create frustrating feel bads, and this is part of the reason why. So I actually think from a strategic complexity standpoint, at a competitive level, I think that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Is actually like in a pretty reasonable state, to be really honest. I don't think that any of the specific iterations are so challenging to engage with that you get kind of bogged down in this analysis paralysis. It's pretty easy to go, I'm going to take this game action, and if I get rolled, I get rolled, but you don't necessarily need to be iterating a ton. And then the last thing that he talked about, this one is, I think, less impactful in some contexts in Yu-Gi-Oh!, is board complexity. And this is the idea of like how hard are boards to read. And this is definitely more of a Magic problem than a Yu-Gi-Oh! Problem. So let's talk about reasons why. In Magic, one of the reasons why boards get so hard to read is many cards will have activated and static effects on the battlefield, which means you have to track both those things, both on your side and on your opponent's side. But then in addition to that, there is a lot of state management that you have to do in Magic, like how many +1/+1 counters does this card have? Increasingly, they're adding things like, keyword counters, like death touch counters or flying counters. And even in more recent sets, they've added cards that like remove abilities from a card, but then haven't actually given a clear way to communicate that on the board, which I think is kind of interesting. And so as a result, Magic boards can get really messy, and the true power and toughness of cards can get challenging to comprehend if things end up with like too many +1/+1 counters for sure. And as they've added more of these kinds of big and splashy effects, that's definitely gotten harder to read. And this, I think, the board complexity is the thing that really generated the most feel bads at the most recent Pro Tour, because these green, mono green and green white landfall decks really do just create unreadable boards of creatures with power and toughnesses that are sometimes undecipherable. And in the Yu-Gi-Oh context, there are kind of a couple of things that help to keep some of these things in check. So obviously the most obvious one is that there are only like 5.5 zones, right? There's the 5 zones, and then there's the extra monster zone. So boards are capped on how complicated they can get. You can only ever have like what, 12 effects, right? Five spell traps, 5 monsters, 1 extra deck monster, and 1 field spell. Like that is the most that you could ever have going on. And that same kind of cap doesn't exist in games like Magic. And so as a result, that in and of itself does help clean up some of the complexity. The other thing that's going on in Yu-Gi-Oh that helps with this board complexity is that a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards, their state management is a binary state that you need to manage. So like, for example, a lot of cards have a once per turn effect. You can use like you can use the effect of Murakumo once per turn, or you can activate a Cool 2 Synchro. Cool 2 Synchro? I always forget what that card is called, but you can access that once per turn, twice per turn. And as a result, it's not so much a situation where you have to track the resources that the person has available to work out how many times they might be able to activate something. It is just, has this been activated? Yes, no. And that's certainly helpful. I do think that tracking the attack and defense points of monsters, like, there are certain decks where that's potentially kind of messy. Like, I'm thinking about things like Yummy, for example, where once you have minion in play, you do have to like do some math and work out exactly how big each of the Yummies are. But it's pretty quick math, all things considered, right? You just work out the number that you're adding to all of them, and then you figure it out. And then the other thing that is helping Yu-Gi-Oh, certainly in this regard as well, is that in terms of board state, the actual attack and defense of monsters matters less in your kind of like back and forths that are going on a lot of the time. In Magic, the power and toughness of creatures is kind of everything a lot of the time, and there are many cards that are dealing X amount of damage. And so as a result, tracking what the actual toughness of everything is pretty important. And this same concept does not exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards either get destroyed or don't get destroyed. Yes, there are cards that care about the amount of attack points that a card has to determine like whether or not it's affected by an effect or things like that. But they're relatively easy to resolve in a way that is not additive, in a way that does not exist for Magic. So in terms of board complexity as well, like at a competitive standpoint, sure, when you are running into one of these like combo soup decks and boards, and they've set up 14 disruptions, and you have to figure out what the 14 disruptions are, it can get a little bit weird. Sorry, my camera is shaking because my cat is cleaning his face on the corner of my monitor where my camera is set up. But yeah, certainly it can get complicated to resolve all these things. And the one thing about board complexity that does happen in Yu-Gi-Oh! That doesn't happen in Magic is the amount of summoning and like tutoring from deck that happens in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the course of a turn. It's much higher in Yu-Gi-Oh! Than it is in Magic. So when you're looking at a board and you're working out what's on the board, you actually secretly a lot of the time also need to be thinking about like what's in the extra deck, what's in the graveyard, etc., etc. But I think even with all of that, the complexity is pretty manageable. So one of the things that Gavin talked about in his video is this idea that aspirationally, I think in Magic, you want simple to understand board states that create complex decisions, and that's kind of aspirational because you want players to be able to actually iterate through the possibilities of what they can do from on their turn, but you want there to be lots of possibilities so that there's still room for skill expression. And that's ultimately what we are looking for here when we're talking about complexity and good complexity is you are ultimately searching for ways to create meaningful skill expression in your game. I think many people will have heard this term or this phrase thrown around, right? That complexity does not equal depth, that these are mutually exclusive terms. But complexity is required in order for there to be depth to a game, right? You can look at something like, say, like tic-tac-toe, which is too simple. And in fact, it is so simple that there is no depth to the game because once you learn what the optimized line is, you can never lose a game again. In the same regard, though, chess, which is simple in terms of understanding how all the pieces move, obviously is incredibly deep with basically endless room for skill expression. So it's not that complexity is required for depth, but it certainly helps. And creating situations where there are lots of iterations are how in modern games, a lot of the time we are attempting to create like deep, interesting gameplay for players. So what is good complexity? What is the kind of complexity that leads to interesting and healthy gameplay for players? And does Yu-Gi-Oh have that right now? Well, if we go back and we look at the three types of complexity, I think there are there's kind of like two that are bad and one that is good. So comprehension complexity, you ideally want this to be as low as possible. You don't want there to be friction on just understanding what your cards do. In a perfect world, you would always just be able to look at a card and say, this is what my card does. I think in that sense, Yu-Gi-Oh is doing just fine, actually. Most modern Yu-Gi-Oh cards, pretty easy to understand. And although there is this, this comprehension barrier of, if this goes and searches something, I need to know what it can search. But the fact that typically these are gated behind archetypes, I think cleans that up to the point where comprehension complexity in Yu-Gi-Oh is at an acceptable level. Next, we are going to talk about board complexity. This one is 50-50. Board complexity does not have to be a bad thing, but you want it to be the right kind of board complexity. And again, I actually think Yu-Gi-Oh has this in a pretty solid way. Most Yu-Gi-Oh cards these days have one or two effects on a board. They don't tend to have like 5 that you need to track and kind of monitor. And like I mentioned, because there is not the same pressure on managing attack and defense points in Yu-Gi-Oh that there is in managing power and toughness in Magic, that also works to keep board complexity to an acceptable level. And then the last one is strategic complexity. This one is mostly a good thing in my mind. I'm not saying that you can never have too much strategic complexity, because if you have too much strategic complexity, you can end up with players in kind of this like analysis paralysis situation where if there are 50 lines that you can go through, that's probably too many. But I think that in general, this is the one that you need at least some of in a trading card game for the game to feel interesting and dynamic for players. And I think right now, if you look at the way that most Yu-Gi-Oh games go, the amount of strategic complexity is kind of in a pretty good sweet spot. Going first, you think about hand traps. There are probably around 10 that you would consider to be like average, maybe 15. I don't know. I didn't do the exact math on how many I would consider to be average, but approximately. So you've got some iterations, but not everything is exposed to every hand trap. So you can kind of think about it. And a lot of the times too, you just have to decide, hey, I'm dead to Ash here and I'm going to jab. because you are obligated to. And going second, typically you have a pretty clear-cut idea of what the board you're trying to break looks like, what its capacity is, if you are playing at a competitive level. And I guess I should say again here, I know I said it at the outset, but I am talking about at a competitive level. I'm kind of talking about probably like the top, 40-ish% of players, people who are really trying to like optimize their gameplay. I think we're really talking about, for those players, is the game in a state where the complexity is acceptable and interesting. Obviously, when you're learning and you're new, some of this complexity is, I don't want to say like too high, but it is unapproachable, and you are unlikely to just easily be able to discern what the correct decision is right away. But as you start to get into things, I think that you do. And I should also note, like, I don't know that I would even put myself, I'm probably not in the top part of that 40%, but I am someone who, when they play trading card games, I'm looking to play them in a competitive way. I'm looking to be making the best decisions in my game. And certainly, like, I feel like now, kind of like, I don't know, maybe 500 or 600 hours in at this point, I'd have to go look at my phone playtime, and that's a bit of a terrifying place to look. So I haven't done it yet, but like I'm closing in now on, I'm going to get to 1,000 hours certainly before the end of the year, of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is the point at which I think you really aspirationally want to be feeling like you are engaging with the competitive depth of the game. And I think that I am. And I think that the strategic complexity is actually, both interesting and pretty healthy as far as trading card games go. So what is meaningful skill expression? What are we really looking for here? I think certainly there are things that are not meaningfully skill expressive. I saw this great clip of Riot August. He's a developer on League of Legends, talking about like this exact concept and about skill expression. And he was basically like, like, not all skill expression is good skill expression. We wouldn't ask you to do calculus to finish your jungle clear in a League of Legends game. And I think that, amusingly, like, that's kind of the state that Magic is in right now, where in order to play these green landfall decks, like, you do kind of like just need to do a bunch of math to even be able to start playing the deck. And that's the kind of skill expression that I think you're looking to pull out of the game. But the meaningful skill expression, the really exciting stuff, I think largely falls into that strategic complexity category. It is about iterating through lines. You want people to be able to make decisions on what your opponent does and have that impact your choice. And I think that there's lots of that in Yu-Gi-Oh! Currently, with really not that much of the kind of less interesting skill expression. One other thing I didn't mention that happens in Magic that doesn't happen in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that because of the way that combat works in Magic, both players have a level of agency that causes, I think, some of that analysis paralysis, or can cause those decisions to become exceptionally difficult. In Magic, just in case you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player who doesn't know, in Magic, one player declares an attack with all of the creatures they're planning to attack with at once, and then the defending player chooses all of their blockers at once. And so what this means is that there's a lot of iterations if these boards get big, like if both players have like 5 or 6 creatures on the board, and you're trying to decide what you're allowed to attack with, because creatures can double block, creatures can triple block. And so while that is a space for skill expression, certainly it can get to be too much. And in Yu-Gi-Oh! You don't have this problem because the battle phase is direct. You choose what you are attacking, and although there are effects that can happen, obviously, there's not this situation of like, I attack with my monster, and then you choose what you're going to defend with, and then all of a sudden I have to do all the permutations of what sequencing the attacks might go, right? Like, you don't have to do that. You, as the attacker, choose the attack sequencing, and then the defender has effects sometimes, but they're not choosing what their defenders are, which I do also think reduces some of this unnecessary, sometimes complexity. Obviously, attacking and blocking in Magic can be interesting and meaningfully skill expressive, but sometimes, especially when it gets to the level it is at in Standard right now, it gets to be too much. So let's talk briefly about what the root causes are in Magic and why I think Yu-Gi-Oh isn't running into those same problems. So there's two things that are going on in Magic. One is that the presence of the Commander format has put this design pressure on Magic cards to be splashier in a multiplayer game. You can't print Magic cards now that are boring, and the reason for that is twofold. One, you need people to get excited about wanting to put them in their Commander deck. But then two, like I mentioned, you've kind of opened this Pandora's box on cards being exciting. And so now if you print things that are a bummer, people are just not going to engage with the set. And so Commander is one of the culprits, certainly. And additionally, historically, cards that we would think of as quote unquote Commander cards have been expensive in mana cost. They've been things that haven't seen play in the more competitive formats. And so as a result, you haven't necessarily seen that same kind of issue. Like you would look at a card in a set spoiler and you would say like, oh yeah, that's a Commander card because it costs 6 mana or 8 mana or whatever, and it has 30 lines of text. And increasingly, as Commander has gotten more optimized, as they've started to design with Commander in mind, those kinds of cards have slid down the mana curve to becoming 5 mana cards, 4 mana cards. I think there's a reasonable argument that Badger Mole Cub was, designed as a competitive staple in Standard for sure, but also it is a big splashy effect that the Commander players are going to love, and that costs 2 mana. So that's one of the things that's going on. The other root cause in Magic, and this is the other design pressure that Magic has, is draft. So obviously all of these sets have to be designed with playing limited in mind, and limited is really important, and the health of limited formats is really important for Wizards, because both in paper, but especially on Arena, you want people to be playing the limited formats because those are the most monetizable for Wizards. It's a way to get competitive players to be spending money on packs, as opposed to just having them, spend money just to get singles. And so having satisfying and interesting draft formats has created this pressure to make it so that all cards feel pickable in draft. If you want a longer form video on Magic Draft, by the way, it is probably my second favorite format in Magic. It's probably Canadian Highlander, and then Draft, and then Legacy, and then Modern, and then I don't know. It's a bit of a crapshoot afterwards. But I really like Limited. I think it's a really fun format. But the pressure that it creates is that they want cards to be interesting, and historically that hasn't always been true. If you look at some of these older Limited formats, the disparity between draftable cards and not draftable cards was massive at times. I started playing competitive Magic, or I started playing like draft Magic around Time Spiral Block was the first time that I really engaged with Magic as a limited game. And let me tell you, as like a 13-year-old trying to navigate Time Spiral drafts, I've gone back and looked at some of those decks that I had like kind of 10 years later. I found them in my bulk, and there are some completely unplayable cards in those draft decks. And increasingly Wizards has tried to make it so that that doesn't happen. And so that every deck kind of has this flat power level, and that you feel like every deck is at least vaguely playable if you get into the right colors. And that has also, I think, created this pressure to create more evocative cards and more verbose cards, so that you can at least feel like you have interesting gameplay, even if you're not opening the best cards in the set. And so Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't have either of these design pressures. They are not designing with this big splashy multiplayer format in mind. They're only designing really with the 1v1 competitive format in mind. And consequently, that means that they are able to, I think, keep cards at what are sort of supposed to be a more appropriate complexity level for navigating a 1v1 game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And they don't have to have ways to have them be splashy in a multiplayer game. So that's one. And then two, obviously, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not designed with limited in mind. And so as a result, this means that from a design standpoint, like you're allowed to just chuck in 1 or 2 cards in a set that clean up some of the complexity issues or some of the lines in an existing archetype in a way that takes it from being this really like hard to navigate deck into being something that's simpler to navigate and also more powerful. I mean, I think Cool Tune's a good example of this. Lunalight is the same, right? Where the deck was pretty complicated and then it gets Gold Leo and all of a sudden it becomes, and Liar Dancer obviously, and it becomes like more simple. There's lots of examples, I'm sure, historically that you could point to as well, where like a couple of cards have gotten printed in a set that have all of a sudden cleaned up a bunch of the lines for a deck and made them much cleaner to understand and play for players. And so I think those two things are really keeping complexity in a more healthy state for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh decks. Obviously, there are still exceptionally complex, competitive-ish Yu-Gi-Oh decks, right? Like DDD and Dragon Link. Like these decks are playable and very complicated still in every way. But in general, if you look at kind of like the top of the meta, they clearly have made a considered decision to try and reduce complexity. I think you can look at things like Draco Tail as a deck that really doesn't take that many game actions to get to its end board and to set up its disruptions. And that, as a result, creates like lower complexity across the board while still creating reasonable strategic complexity, where you still end up with all of these interactions that you have to deal with. I'm not going to litigate my position on Draco Tail here. I'm sure people are tired of hearing about it. But similarly, if you look at an archetype like Cool Tune as well, the complexity on that archetype is lower. And some of the reasons for that are, if you look at all of the synchros, they have a clear tie-in with a main deck monster. And as a result, it makes it so that the lines of what you can resolve are simpler, right? Like, yes, you have cards that let you search anything in your deck. And so as a result, you can get any name. But if you're just like looking at a hand and trying to work out, okay, what names does my hand make? What extra deck monsters does my hand make? I mean, you know that there are these pairs of extra deck monsters and main deck monsters that you can kind of resolve pretty quickly and work out exactly what your options are. And even if you look at decks like Yummy and VSK9 from the last format and Mitsurugi, all of the lines in these decks, in the pure forms of them at least, or the kind of like more, well, VSK9 is not pure, but like pure Yummy, pure Mitsurugi, like all of the lines in these decks are relatively clear once you learn them. It's not like it's not something where these are 20-step combos to get to your end board. Obviously, once you start getting into building a bunch of bridges and making other archetypes, like, yeah, they get more complicated, but the basic lines to end on the basic end boards are relatively simple to get through. And as a result, that means that players are ending up getting to get to the more interesting strategic endpoints of, how do I play through these hand traps? How do I play through my opponent's boards faster? So I do think that overall, Yu-Gi-Oh has, like, in a lot of ways, resolved a bunch of the competitive complexity issues that other games like Magic are struggling with. I think if you look at more modern games, you see them leveraging actually similar approaches to what Yu-Gi-Oh has done. Something like Riftbound, for example, self-contains combats into one battlefield at a time. And as a result, you get to reduce the amount of iterations that you might see in any particular combat. You don't have to necessarily worry about again, assigning all your attackers, they assign all their blockers. You know what they have in the battlefield when you're attacking, or if you're defending, you know what they have committed to the battlefield or what they can commit to the battlefield. And as a result, it's relatively clean to clear up. So yeah, I think I'm going to call it there. There's more to talk about with this, but overall, my conclusion would be that I actually think currently that modern competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not too complicated. And in fact, that the complexity in modern competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is both healthy and interesting in a way that you don't necessarily see in every game currently. And I know that it is easy to kind of like doom and gloom about the state of the game, but I do think it's good to come back every now and then and look at the things that are going right. And from my perspective, at least, as a kind of like newer entrant into this game, I actually think that modern Yu-Gi-Oh is hitting a pretty good sweet spot currently, in terms of the competitive complexity of games. And there's obviously probably one caveat there, which is that when non-games happen, obviously this all goes out the window, and your mileage may vary on how many non-games you feel like there are in modern Yu-Gi-Oh. I think that right now it's not too bad personally, but certainly those anything I've just said goes out the window if you play a game where you get like double hand trapped and then they droll you on your first search and it stops you from going off. Like, that happens still in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, and obviously you then don't have any interesting complexity. But in the games that actually manifest as games, I think that it's in a really great state. So that's all I've got for today. That's all I've got for the video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for supporting. If you are supporting me on the Patreon, your name is on screen right now. You can find the link for that in the description below. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.